Hi, I'm so glad both of you are here. Malcolm Gladwell and Bruce Headlam, thank you for
Hello.
being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, this is really, really cool. You guys have been doing such incredible stuff separately, but you've come together around one fascinating topic, Mr. Paul Simon. Can you tell us why? What encouraged you or inspired you to do this?
Why we chose Paul Simon or why we chose to work together?
Why did you choose Paul Simon?
Well, we wanted to do at Pushkin. We've been very interested in doing these immersive audiobooks that are really make use of audio as opposed to someone sitting in a closet and reading.
Right.
And we thought a musician would be a natural, because you want to hear a musician. So then the question was, which musician? So I went out to LA and I met with Jody Gerson, who runs Universal. And I said, which musician? And she said, Paul Simon, of course. And which I was like, that sounds amazing because I happen to be, and I know Bruce is as well, Paul Simon fans of longstanding. So it was Jody Gerson's idea. And the idea, I think, was there somebody who had enough, who had a career worth talking about for hours and hours and hours, who was a good talker, who had things to say, and who had appeal to a broad stretch of the public. And Paul checks all those boxes.
That is so cool. I can't wait to dive in a little bit more to what you've learned in this process. Bruce, since you haven't been on this podcast before, I want to just intro you a little bit. You've been working in the music world a long time. You have a phenomenal podcast of your own, Broken Record. So why did you come to this? For you know so much about so many musicians. So for you, why was this so exciting and captivating?
It goes back to a conversation Malcolm and I had in 2015 when we would get together over a beer, and we would always like sort of fix journalistic problems. What would you do if you ran this magazine? What would you do here? What would you do there? And was sort of our conversation for years and years. And Malcolm was always very interested in audio, mainly I think because he drove a lot and he would get bored driving. He had to do, something while he was waiting for, his next speeding ticket. And he got very interested in this idea of a more interactive sort of audio experience. I'd been at somebody's cabin and there's nothing to read. And I picked up an autobiography of a very famous musician, and it was terrible. It was so boring. It was all about rehab and all this stuff and all his friends. Had nothing to do with music. And I remember at the time saying, we should do music. I'm sure Malcolm had already thought of that, but that's why I always thought this would be great. And then, lo and behold, I guess 6 or 7 years later, or whatever it was, Malcolm said, hey, Paul Simon may want to do this. What do you think? And I think, as we explained in the book, we had a very early experience with Paul Simon, which is that Malcolm's mother borrowed Bridge Over Troubled Water from the Elmira Public Library, which is a little town where we lived. And I remember listening to it at Malcolm's house when we were probably 7, I'm guessing. And it made a big impression on me. So it was a thrill.
Oh my God. Okay. First of all, I know a little bit about both of you to the extent that you've both done so many incredible things in the world. But I just learned that you've known each other since you're 7 years old.
6.
That is awesome and adorable. And you're both so intimidating. And there's something so human about the fact that you were once 6 years old and knew each other before you were such successful, mega stars. I love that. Did you have an inkling that you would both wind up being who you are today? Did you know that then? Did you see that in each other?
Do you want to answer? You go first.
I saw always a lot in Malcolm. He always looked at things differently. He had a very analytical mind. His father's a mathematician. I didn't know we'd end up working together, lo these many years later. If we live to be 110, we may work together again. But Malcolm became a journalist before I did. I was trying to be a filmmaker. This was up in Canada, and I needed to pay to get the film stock developed, which was very expensive. And Malcolm said, "Oh, you should try writing for this magazine," and that's how I became a journalist. So he is the path breaker here.
That's awesome.
Bruce was always
I was going to say, what about you?
the funniest. He was the funniest person I'd ever met. And he was also, the Headlams were far more culturally sophisticated than the Gladwells. The Headlams had cable TV and watched PBS, and this was just, to my mind, so, and they, played in classical orchestras, and they were, they represented all that was cosmopolitan in our little farming town in southwestern Ontario.
Yeah, so, we represented all that was cosmopolitan in our little farming town.
The Headlams occupied this kind of privileged cultural space in our town. So Bruce was the kind of my entry point to a lot of this stuff.
I just love this. And I love for listeners at home right now or wherever you are listening to just think of this moment that these two adorable kids, I'm just going to take the liberty to say you were adorable because I imagine you were, that you were listening to this Bridge Over Troubled Water, and then cut to the two of you are in a position where you have so much gravitas and you are spending this time with Paul Simon doing a deep dive on his life's work. Mm-hmm. Like, that is incredible. And it just shows you what happens when there is a genuine curiosity in a person and a goodness and the willingness to just march forward very clearly on a journey, which you both have. So Malcolm, I want to ask you, since you have been so curious for so long about so many things, and you know a little bit about history, and you host, Revisionist History. Is there something you learned about Paul Simon that came as a surprise to you in his history?
Yeah, I guess I knew vaguely, from listening to him for years and years and years and years and years, I was aware of his extraordinary longevity as an artist, which is really the thing that attracted us to, one of the things that attracted us to him was that Paul Simon was a singer who has been musically relevant in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts.
It's incredible.
And you could argue that he still is. But it wasn't, but kind of spending all that time with him, what I learned a little bit was, and what we tried to uncover in the book, is why. And it was this really just interesting study in how somebody can remain creatively fertile for 70 years, 75 years. It's kind of amazing. Like, his peers, stopped writing songs in their 20s, and many of them, and he's still going strong in his 80s or 70s. So that was, I think, what we both got insight into was what makes him tick a little bit.
Yeah, you're right. That's like a phenomenon, because you can think about artists and, this hit and that single, and to think that it's just like this nonstop water, running water of like inspiration and quality music is really unique. What was one of the most memorable things that you learned about him that did inspire him on those, on this journey?
I wouldn't say it inspired him. It certainly drove him. And I think I feel even a little embarrassed saying it, but it is in the audiobook, which is that, he and Art Garfunkel met when they were very, very young. And Art Garfunkel was like this star kid in Queens. He sang all the music at his own bar mitzvah. He was the one with the great voice. And at one point, Paul's mother said to him, you've got a nice voice, Paul, but Artie has a fine voice.
Mm.
And he said this probably 3 times. He told us that story. And it still kind of gets him, and it gets to him. And I think it's one reason after they broke up, he so completely reinvented himself. He reinvented how he wrote music. And then he took this, really starting before Graceland, but he took this whole dive into rhythmic music, and he sings in a very, very particular way now. That's very different than how he sang with Art Garfunkel. And that to me is fascinating.
It is.
And he just didn't pull the covers up over his head, which would have been my inclination. And it just sort of drove him to do different things. And I think a little bit of that hurt still drives him, which is, I'm not recommending that for a long career, that you should dredge up things you found insulting that your mother told you, but it's one of the things that kind of keeps him going.
Yeah, we had Tim Grover here, who was Michael Jordan's trainer, and he said that even in his his peak was so long, but in those moments he would go by himself into the locker room and sort of remind himself of things that were said to him in his days in North Carolina, so that he had fight in him for the game.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he'd have to remember the rejection, remember to push up against something. And I love that as a lesson for people listening, that there's a gift in that. Somebody
Mm-hmm.
tells you something that looks like it's a stop sign, and you actually use that to fuel you. It's like that resistance actually is what builds the muscle.
Yeah. Michael Jordan mentioned every one of those in his Hall of Fame speech, if you've ever heard that. It's like this catalog of slights. And at some point I want to say, man, can't you put it away? But I guess not.
Yeah. So let's take a turn here for a second, because everyone who listens to this podcast, we've been doing this show for just about 5 years, and we just hit 25 million downloads. And I think the reason being is because this topic, don't keep your day job, is really about people who have a creative passion and they want to be able to go do that thing. And you both have been really, especially in this last season, but for many years, like looking at creative people, but also creating incredible content. What can you share with us that you recognize that makes something resonate when you want to create something that is noticed, that people stop and appreciate? Is there any through line in the work you see in Paul Simon and the work you've seen in other people, in your own work, from podcasts to books? Like, what's one of the inherent pieces or qualities that makes something resonate with an audience?
Well, Paul talks a lot about trial and error and experimentation. And, everyone claims that they experiment, they like to experiment, but few people actually do. And I feel like he's someone who genuinely believes in the importance of that kind of risk-taking, and is strong enough and courageous enough to handle the idea that he might fail. He has failed. He did that Broadway play, The Cape Man, poured his heart and soul into it, and it was a disappointment. The critics, sort of turned, and the audience a little bit turned their back on it. I think that really, really, really stung him. I mean, when he would talk about it, it was clear that it really left a mark. But I feel like he learned from that and goes back and tries something else. Or if you look at Graceland, arguably his creative high watermark, what does he do after Graceland? He goes to a different part of the world, Brazil, and starts all over again with another experiment with a tradition outside of his own. So like the amount of times he's willing to risk his legacy, to try to do something on Broadway when he's not a playwright, to do something in South Africa and then Brazil. I mean, that's the admirable thing. And I think he understands that connecting with an audience on a consistent basis requires taking risks. Just keep trying things until you find something that connects. And sometimes it doesn't work with Cape Man. And sometimes it really does work with Graceland.
I love that answer. I've often heard people say that it really isn't so much of a idea problem as it's a courage problem. You know, the courage to show up for those ideas, because people want to know. They want to know it's a sure bet before they go ahead and try anything. And you're right, that is very admirable, because he has been so bold in his choices over and over and over again. Do you have a different answer to that, Bruce?
Well, I completely agree with what Malcolm said. I mean, I guess it's the difference between persistence, doing the same thing, and tenacity, which is coming at it from a different angle. And he always comes at it from a different angle. I think the other thing he had, and this sort of argues against the lonely genius thesis, is he found people who wanted to experiment as much as he did. And that was crucial. You know, I would say one of the great joys of this project, I would say one of the great joys of knowing Malcolm, is Malcolm can say, you know, we could do an audiobook about Paul Simon. That was kind of the end of the conversation until we'd actually recorded things, because I think we both had a feeling for what that would be. And I felt I just had this, he knows what it's going to be. I know what it's going to feel like, even though we hadn't done any work yet. I had that assurance that Malcolm wanted to do something different and that we experiment in the same. We had many disagreements over different parts of it. But that was one of the great things about this. You know, and that's something I didn't always have when I worked at the New York Times. There were a lot of experiments, you know, I wanted to try, and some of them I got done. But by the time you explain them 5 times to people, you kind of give up. Like, you just need that one other person to go, oh, I get it. I get it. After the first sentence, you know, if you've got to give them a paragraph, it's no good. If you give them one sentence, they go, oh yeah, go do that. And he had that. I mean, I interviewed a couple, Roy Halley, who's his engineer, and there's one episode that's sort of built around Roy Halley, who met Paul Simon when he was first auditioning for the record label, and Roy Halley was a guy who did classical music, and he just saw in Paul, this guy just wants to do different things. And to me, being a bit of a music nerd, a lot of the stuff I found fascinating were all the kind of experiments they did in a studio, putting Simon and Garfunkel actually in an echo chamber, which they never put singers in there. It's complicated, but you record through that. But nobody had ever put singers in there before. Yeah. Nobody had ever tried this. Nobody had ever tried that. And Roy Halley loves to experiment as much as Paul Simon. And I think, you know, as critical as Art Garfunkel was early on, I think sort of having this person who was like, absolutely, let's just try it, and I don't think they had to talk about it. That sounds silly. Let's not talk about it. But it was just this knowing that somebody else is kind of willing to throw themselves at this, I think was critical for him. And I don't think his career would have been nearly the same without Roy Halley. There's always, you know, people in the record business and every business that will kind of inhibit you. You just got to find that one person, and he did. I mean, I have 2, so I count myself very lucky. But I think for Paul, that was critical.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And what you said in the beginning, where you both discussed it and you didn't have to talk about it, you just knew, like, oh, I could picture what that's like. I visited my dad yesterday, and he's in the hospital, and he's going through, like, you know, something really challenging. And he was just sort of doing what people sometimes do in those moments, reminiscing about his, like, childhood. And he was talking about growing up in Brooklyn and how his dad didn't get how special baseball was to him as a kid. And he was talking about seeing Mickey Mantle play. And his dad said, I don't get it. It's just a guy throwing a ball. And he goes, no, it's not a guy throwing a ball, because it's him. And we were talking yesterday about people who, there's just such a weight. There's something about what they do that it's coming from the depth of their being, that it's not just a guy throwing a ball. And I think Paul Simon is like that. And that's why you didn't really have to talk about it. You could just picture, because there's something in the fabric of his essence when he performs. It's just an extension of the most honest, true expression of who he is. And he's just, there's there's a level of goodness and mastery in his work. And that's why you just go, oh, I know what that's like, right? It's like, you know, Larry King sitting down with someone or Barbara Walters sitting down with someone is not just, oh, it's a person talking to another person. It's like, well, it's not, you know, there's something going on that's inherently different. And I get that about Paul Simon. I was going to go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, he was also the experimenter with us, because I don't know if anyone's ever done a project.
No, I don't think so.
And I met with him. We had lunch one day, 2 years ago, and I had said very vaguely to him on the phone what we were interested in doing. I just sat down with him and said, well, we just want to come and talk to you and record it and do something interesting with it. And he didn't really require any additional explanation.
He's like, okay.
He was like, yeah, well, I'll try that. You know,
casual, just casual. Yeah.
You know, people have written biographies about him, but that's a very specific thing where you sit and you are interviewed and then the interview goes off. Right. And I was saying, well, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about a partnership where, you know, we make this together and you're going to play and we're going to ask you questions and Bruce and I are going to come up with theories about you and we'll throw it all together somehow and see if it works. And there wasn't even any hesitation. He was like, and then after we were done, he drove me home. You know, I live downtown, he lives uptown. So it's like, he was, you know, it was that kind of speaks to the generosity of the way he approached this whole project.
Yeah. And also I think his respect for the work that you both do, where he was just like, yeah, that would be fun to spend that time with the two of you. Yeah. I'm curious.
If I'd known that, I would have asked him to pick me up at the airport. That's
right.
I knew he was so obliging. No, and he was. I mean, we spent the first day listening to the songs that really influenced him. All these amazing old doo-wop songs, and he loved these very particular things about them. Like he's not I just love old rock and roll, so I'm going to do an old rock and roll record. He's like, you know, listen here, listen how the voices work here, listen to the rhythm under this, listen to this guitar solo. This guy must have been a jazz player. I think it may have been Mickey Baker. He's very, very particular about the things that he hears and what he wants to do with them. He's not remotely sentimental. He doesn't say, I'll do a rockabilly album, because that's what, you know, a lot of people do. He says, no, I want to capture this particular facet of this performance and then put it in something completely different. So he's interesting that way. He's not sentimental. But he was, you know, we'd go up, when we saw him in Connecticut, he'd just come in, say hi, make a giant pot of coffee, and we'd just sit there and drink coffee with Paul Simon and talk. It was very relaxed.
It's awesome. It's incredible. And it is so unusual the way that you guys created this. And I hope that you'll do more because it's so special. Malcolm, I think our audience would want to know, does he fit your description of an outlier? And if so, can you kind of recap a little bit of a couple of those pieces and how he fits that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he does. If you remember from that book, one of the arguments about outliers was that they were people who were fortunate in where they were from. So I spent a lot of time talking about what does it mean to be born at a certain time in a certain place. Remember, there was a chapter on why are so many of the successful lawyers in New York Jewish, born in more than that, born in the mid-30s. So was there something about being born in 1935 and being Jewish that helped you become a very successful lawyer? And the answer is there is. And that chapter walks through that question. And with Paul, there's one of the chapters of Miracle and Wonder is called The Gift of Queens. And it's all about, well, what does it mean to grow up in Queens in the 1950s, if you're interested in music? And it means something, the argument of that chapter is that it means something very specific, that you're being exposed to this incredible range of musical traditions all around you. There's doo-wop, there's Latin music, there's the music of his own culture, there's, you know, the beginnings of rock and roll, there's R&B, there's everything happening, but not just on the radio, it's happening in your neighborhood. And there's also this kind of the gift of Queens, though, which I think is something that a gift he got from that time and place, was this idea that all of the world's cultural offerings were yours to sample. You weren't trespassing or stealing or appropriating when you explored someone else's cultural tradition. To be a kid in Queens in the 50s is like, no, the world's your oyster. Like, the kids sitting next to you in schools from Puerto Rico, and your parents are Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and you guys got to share those traditions with each other. You're side by side in the classroom. Like that kind of, and that's first of all, that idea doesn't exist in the same way today. And there isn't that same kind of cultural mixing today. He's a different, and I think probably lesser singer if he's not from Queens in the 50s. That was the argument of that chapter. So I do think he benefits enormously. The argument of Outliers is exceptional performance is natural ability plus some set of advantages of environmental, cultural, situational advantages. And he's that in spades.
I love that.
Which is interesting because at a certain point in his career, it was a disadvantage. When Simon and Garfunkel started playing in Greenwich Village and started writing folk songs, they weren't liked because there's the sort of big characters there were like Bob Dylan and Dave Van Ronk and Ramblin' Jack Elliott, who by the way was rambled all the way from Brooklyn. But they believed in a very they were trying to put themselves in this sort of tradition of American folk music. Woody Guthrie was their hero. Bob Dylan, in fact, told this whole story about how he'd ridden the rails and cooked at a lumber camp and done all this stuff. Yesterday, I interviewed Judy Collins, who was a singer back then.
Oh my gosh!
Still a great singer, and I laughed because she's from Denver and she actually she worked in national parks. She was a ranger.
Right.
She cooked at this camp one year, and I said, "You actually led the life that Bob Dylan pretended he led." But Simon and Garfunkel, being from Queens was not exotic. They had a hit when they were kids called "Hey Schoolgirl," when they were called Tom and Jerry. This is Simon and Garfunkel, and this, for the people in the Village, this was just awful. Dave Van Ronk said in his biography that you could get a reliable laugh at a West Village coffee shop just by strumming your guitar and saying, "Hello, darkness, my old friend," because this was like, ugh. And their first album was a failure until it was re-released. They re-released the single a year later, so their first album failed. So it's, I think Malcolm makes the persuasive case that's a difficult thing to go through, but it is kind of freeing in a way. He didn't have to pretend to be another person in a way that I think a lot of those people did.
That's so...
Not the women, interestingly. Not Baez, not Joni Mitchell, not Judy Collins, who, as I said, actually did live that life. But with a lot of the men, it was like, to be a child star from Queens. Ugh. So
wow. It's so...
I think he showed them.
Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty sure you're right. Yeah, it's almost hard to hear it because it sounds like the words you're saying are just so foreign to our experience. And Lisa Henson, who's Jim Henson's daughter, is a good friend of mine. And she says similarly about her father, that people just assume that he had this success and there wasn't a prequel to that success. And we were talking about that because she has kids who are now in their teens and they kind of look at that. And I think that's, this is a very obvious point we're making, but it's, especially with social media, you just see sort of this highlight reel and you don't really get what was really happening. And I can't believe what you just said, especially about, strumming a few bars of "Hello, Darkness, my old friend." Like, that's one of the greatest songs of all time. And in this moment for them, that wasn't really the case. So Malcolm, to go back to your work, so what was it that was really the tipping point for them or for him?
For Simon and Garfunkel, or for Paul Simon?
Yeah.
Um, well, what was their, you know, as Bruce was saying, first album is a commercial failure, and then a producer takes Sound of Silence uh, and what does he do? He puts in Bruce. Do you remember? Puts in.
It was Tom Wilson, who's still he should be better known. He was African American from Harvard who produced a lot of early Dylan and a lot of the great early folk music, and people don't know about him. They should. He just added drums and he gave it a beat. I think a year later with Roy Halley, who worked on it, and it became a huge hit. So it was just sort of not happenstance, but they just thought about it in a different way. And Paul Simon was living in England at that point, and suddenly heard that he had a hit. It was like finding out you had a baby when you're overseas, I suppose. But and then they got back together and kept working.
He has a very funny in the book. There's a very funny thing where he talks about, in those days you found out how well your song was doing by checking the trade press would have the Billboard 100 or whatever the list of, and songs that were moving up quickly had a bullet, and you would get this every week, and you'd look at, and he keeps seeing I guess I think it was the Billboard 100 or some equivalent to it.
Yeah, it would have been. Yeah.
And he's outside the top 100, and then the next week he's a little higher, and the next week he's a little higher, and each time, and he's so kind of like superstitious about it that he starts from the bottom and looks up. He can't, trying to see, well, how high did I get this week? How high did I get this week? And then finally, he goes, I don't know, did it reach number one, Bruce? I can't remember.
I don't know if it reached number one, but I know that he would put his hand over the top of the chart, and of course, so when it kept rising, he just assumed it had fallen off. So he was just, because he couldn't kind of bear it. And then what? I've got a top 10 hit.
Wow.
Yeah.
So in terms of their, greatest sort of crescendo, does The Graduate play a huge role in that, or not as much?
The Graduate is interesting because, for a lot of reasons, but he actually had a song called Mrs. Roosevelt he was working on, and it became Mrs. Robinson perfectly. And it's really, you sort of realize it takes longer for the culture to sort of catch up than you think. It's really the first pop song to win the Grammy for best song.
Wow.
Before that, it was really like Sinatra and American Songbook stuff. I think maybe Fifth Dimension won for something. But yeah, it's kind of a breakthrough. Like it's a sort of counterculture, first counterculture song to win best song. So yeah, I think it was a big deal.
But it's the start of, Kathy, it's the start of this really interesting thing that one of the things that Paul does over the course of his career is he's constantly allying himself with other cultural movements. So there he teams up with one of the great filmmakers of the day and contributes this iconic song that almost defines the movie, and the movie is an enormous hit. So he's associated with, wait, I'm now blanking on the movie maker's name. Bruce,
Mike Nichols.
Mike Nichols.
Yeah.
He's aligning himself with one of the greatest figures in Hollywood. Later, of course, he will become very, very closely associated with Saturday Night Live because he's really good friends with Lorne Michaels. And he becomes a fixture on Saturday Night Live during the golden years of that show. And again, he allies himself with an extraordinarily powerful cultural movement. And then what is Graceland? Graceland's a version of that. He's allying himself with this sort of world music movement, which becomes incredibly, largely because of Graceland, becomes an incredibly important. So it's this, he has this kind of gift, this intuition for understanding the kinds of creative partnerships that will put him in the conversation, the kind of cultural conversation.
I think that sounds, and I know you don't mean it this way, Malcolm, but people knew Mike Nichols in New York. And they knew him from Virginia Woolf, which is the film he'd made. But he, nobody knew The Graduate was going to be a big thing. Not that many people knew about Mike Nichols. Saturday Night Live, he was on in the first season, one of the first episodes. So it was still a bit of a mystery then. And Graceland, it's not, looking back now, people say, well, African music was becoming so big. It wasn't at that point. It was, and his previous album, Hearts and Bones, had been a commercial failure. I mean, he went to do Graceland because he thought, well, nobody's going to care what I do. I might as well do something interesting. So it's not as though he's not catching the wave. I mean, he is catching the wave in a sense, but not in a cynical.
He's identifying the wave.
Yes, he is, absolutely.
That's the thing. He's not aligning himself with movements that are popular. He's the one who understands that something interesting is going on with Saturday Night Live, and something interesting is going on with Mike Nichols, and something interesting is going on in Africa. He's on the early side of that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's a beautiful way to see that. What a gift to be able to intuit that. I'm curious because Bruce, I mean, I don't know what it's like to win a Pulitzer Prize, but it's got to feel like a big validation in your life.
Well, neither do I officially, because editors' names don't go on Pulitzer Prizes.
Okay, fine.
I've had journalists win Pulitzer Prizes.
All right, we'll just say it's near you. It's associated with you.
It's near me.
And Malcolm has had so many, smash success over and over, incredible best-selling books. It's just kind of people expect it at this point. And Paul Simon similarly. So I guess the question is, at some point for each of you and for him, do you feel like there's a pressure of, this has to perform at that level? Or is there just a joy for each of you in like, I want to do this work regardless, and I won't be crushed. I mean, really being honest, if this thing is not as successful as the last, because it's probably a very beautiful and yet challenging thing when there is that expectation at such a high level.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've always been struck by is new things take a long time to get accepted. That when even the telephone, I was using the example of the telephone. Telephone's invented in the 70s. Most Americans don't have a telephone until the 1920s. It takes 50 years for people to understand that, oh, this is actually useful thing to have in your home. That's a dumb example, but
no, it's a great example. That is a great example. Yep. Okay.
But I didn't think I don't think any of us at Pushkin. I mean, we would love if this was a huge commercial success, but it wasn't about that. It was about trying to explore what audio can do, and how can we work with artists, with creative people, and do something unusual and special and groundbreaking, and with the understanding that this will lead somewhere. It's really about the next one we do. It's not, now that and this is a calling card, we've already gotten calls from other artists who have listened to this and said, oh,
that's so cool.
We would like to do something similar. That's really the kind of, that's the way I think this kind of process works, is you're setting the table for others to come and dine with you.
I love that. That's really exciting. And do you feel that he has a similar take, or do you feel like it's been challenging for him when things didn't reach the certain level?
Well, he still talks about Cape Man, his Broadway play, which didn't do as expected. It's still, am I right, Bruce? That was when he talked about Cape Man, that was some of the most emotionally kind of fraught moments in all our interviews.
Well, and I think this relates to what Malcolm's talking about with Pushkin and Paul Simon. Paul Simon he doesn't sit down to write a certain kind of record. But he goes through a process of getting interested in sounds and collecting lyrics. And I think Cape Man hurts him in a way because it was such a, putting on a Broadway show is so large and so collaborative. It took him out of how he does things. It took him away from what he's good at. The music in that, by the way, is beautiful. But he depended on other people in a way he doesn't depend on them for other projects. And when I think about, well, what will the next thing be? I always think I don't work at Pushkin, but if someone phoned me and said, gee, I loved what you did with Paul Simon, I'd like to do the same thing. I think the first conversation should be, okay, but understand it's a process of figuring out what would work for you. We're not going to do a Paul Simon for you, whoever you are. Thanks, Eric Clapton, or whoever it would be. You sit down and you figure out what would work for that person. It may end up being very, very different. So I think I think that's one thing I sort of learned from Paul Simon, which is you kind of go through that process, and the process, you end up with something very, very different. So I don't think suddenly there's going to be like this meat grinder turning out audiobooks about, musicians. Weirdly, one of the most fascinating interviews I've done, and you may find this ridiculous, on Broken Record, was Huey Lewis.
I love Huey.
Huey Lewis has one of the most fascinating lives you can imagine. He just opens his mouth and he's super interesting. I don't think I'd want to do a whole audiobook with Huey Lewis in the same. He was an unbelievable interview, and I encourage you to listen to it because it's fabulous. But so for everybody, it should be a different thing, and that's that's the trying to come up with something new. And of course, Malcolm does this really better than anybody I can imagine. Is kind of it is that process, and that's how you produce something new. You don't. As I said, I think Cape Man, because it took him out of what he felt comfortable doing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But good for him. He created fabulous music, and so a snotty critic at the New York Times didn't like it. Sadly, that's enough to kind of kill a Broadway show if the New York Times doesn't like it. But he did it. Music's great. And he told a story that nobody else had told. He told a story very much from his childhood, the Cape Man, and about the Puerto Rican community. It wasn't a feel-good story, so I think he should be incredibly proud.
Speaking of him being incredibly proud, what did you learn for him was the happiest, the most fulfilling chapter for him?
I don't know, Bruce, am I wrong? I don't know if he thinks that way. Do you get the sense he thought that way? I got the sense that it's all about the next thing. I don't think he would have said, I think he would have said Cape Man was a low point, but at the same time, he understands exactly what you just said about Cape Man, that it's actually kind of cool. He tried something, he took the risk and created something really unusual, probably just ahead of its time in some ways. I don't know whether, and I think he's allergic to the idea, particularly someone like that who's in a creative field. If you do rank your moments, then you become very, very conscious of things like creative decline. If you say, I'm going to judge myself by my music sales, well, what's his best-selling album? I mean,
Graceland or Bridge, probably.
Bridge or Graceland. But Graceland's 1986. It's now 2021. He still wants to make music. Do you really want to if you think that way, then you're in this position where you think that the last 40 years have been decline, right? So I think he's allergic to that idea. I think he thinks so long as I'm engaged in what I'm doing and I'm enjoying myself, then right now is the best time.
He said, for a time, in his case, for a long time, what the culture was interested in and what he was interested in were very close. They were intertwined. That's not the case now. We make a case for his later albums, which have, I think, just some very different. If you're expecting Bridge Over Troubled Water, you won't get it. But there's some songs on there I just adore that I find incredibly resonant. David Byrne says that So Beautiful or So What is his best album. I think Elvis Costello said the same thing. So
that's an album from
13 something.
2013, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think Malcolm's absolutely right. You get trapped in that version of success. It reminds me of two things. One, we did a chapter about his singing, and with Simon and Garfunkel, they would always decide once he'd written the song who's going to take the lead. But except for Bridge, the song "Bridge Over Troubled Water," which he gave to Artie because he wrote it very high and he wrote it for a solo voice, and of course it's a stunning, stunning record. And but he didn't sing it. But of course, once he's a solo artist, everybody's like they want to hear his biggest hit, and it took him until 2017 until he came up with a version very different that he felt that song was his own.
Oh my God.
So that's, he always felt uncomfortable with it.
Yeah.
Whereas, if I'd written Bridge Over Troubled Water, I'd be singing it in the shower.
Yeah,
No matter how bad my voice was, that would be the first thing I would literally tell everybody I met. But for him, it was, so I think even something that was one of his greatest triumphs for him still becomes a process of figuring out in a new way.
Yeah. All right. So last question about Paul Simon, then we're going to wrap up, is in terms of his life as a person, as a human, as a friend, as a husband. I mean, being in the public for so many decades it's a lot on a person. How do you think he's dealt with that? How do you think that that's affected him?
Well, one of the things we did in this book was we did these cameos where we interviewed other musicians about Paul Simon. And one of the people we interviewed was Sting, who knows Paul very well. And Sting, I interviewed Sting, and Sting is like in a French chateau, and there's what looks like a Monet over his shoulder. And he's the best looking guy you've ever met in your entire life. And he's absolutely, the cameo is fantastic because he's so perfectly articulate and brilliant and funny, and he's a rock star. And I am rarely intimidated by people, totally intimidated by Sting. I was like, oh my God, this guy he's got charisma. He has more charisma in his little finger than most of us do. And Paul, that's one response to fame and celebrity, or one version of it. Paul's the opposite. He's very unassuming. He's the kind of, if Sting's on one end of the continuum, Paul Simon's on the other end. When we were in Hawaii, Paul would drive himself an hour into the hills to our recording studio. Sting hasn't driven himself in 30 years. Paul, when I met him for the first time, we're just sitting in some restaurant, some sort of mediocre Italian restaurant in Times Square. And he's like sitting in the back with a baseball cap. It's like, he's not, his response to his celebrity has been to insist on his kind of ordinariness. He doesn't play the rock star card, which I think is kind of fantastic.
Oh, I think it's one of the coolest things you've shared today. That's really awesome.
I'd say two things about that. First, I feel a little embarrassed sharing because it's not part of the project, but I thought it was so sweet, which is one day when we were in Hawaii, we did drive up together. And it was up in this mountain in this little studio that was a former, like a vegetable cellar, fruit cellar. It was very cool.
Oh my God,
anyway,
so cute.
But we went to his house there, and we met his wife, Edie Brickell, who's famous in her own right. And I chatted to her because she had worked with a musician I knew in Toronto, and she was totally lovely, and she's working on this new project. Anyway, so we get in the car, we're driving, and he goes, damn. It was February 14th. He goes, we got to turn around. I'm like, okay, did you forget something? Whatever. Turn around, go back. It's like he remembered it's Valentine's Day. He goes, I got to kiss my wife goodbye on Valentine's Day. Yeah, it was very sweet. No, he already bought her stuff. And then I think later we took him out and he bought more chocolates or something.
That is so
that was
cute.
A very sweet moment. And the other thing I took away, and this isn't just about him, I think it's the way we think about artists. He said something to me once, I think we were talking about the boxer,
Oh, I love that
I
song.
was wondering about how personal it was. He said, "Well, I didn't know I was feeling that way at the time, but clearly I was." And it made me think how we think about art, particularly about music. You know, the Adele model is, oh my God, Adele's had a divorce. What are the divorce songs going to be? And that's one way people tend, you know, somebody's happy, somebody's doing a
Right.
breakup album, somebody's strung out. This is what they produce. I think that's the wrong model, and I think Paul Simon shows that he's sort of grappling with all kinds of things, mostly technical things. The music produces the emotion, not the other way around. Paul Simon feeling lonely or sad doesn't produce the boxer. There's part of that in there, but even he understands himself through his own work. He didn't know he was feeling he was that well, he wasn't a poor boy at that point, but that's not really the important part of the song is being lonely and feeling alone in a city. And he understood that about himself by writing the song, not the other way around. And that to me, I don't know why I found that so profound. It just kind of changed how I think about music now. I don't think about what was the person feeling when
Mm.
they did that. You think of what is the feeling that emerges. And of course, what's beautiful about that is if musician does it well, and he's done it better than just about anybody, we can all share in that emotion. But
Yeah.
that's how he understands himself too. And that to me, it just changed how I think about music and how I interview people now for
Yeah, it
the
makes
podcast.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but
It's,
it didn't occur to me until I spent time with him.
that makes so much sense because obviously we're all so much more multidimensional than people sort of paint things with these brushes. In this moment, this is what it is. And so recently, of course, the great Stephen Sondheim just passed, and people were posting their favorite lyrics, and they just slay you. Like just reading these lyrics, like one at a time, you're just like, oh my God, right? Isn't it nice to know a lot and a little bit not? Like all, like any line, basically. No one is
Mm-hmm.
alone, right? Children will listen. They're so good. So just for each of you, doesn't have to be your favorite lyric, but what is one of the lyrics that just like hits you? Like one of his lyrics, just one.
We have a chapter devoted to this, to the line from the song Tenderness, which I tried to convince Paul was his quintessential song. It was just try some tenderness beneath your honesty.
Mm.
My mind is so much of his music is about that idea. It's a really beautiful one.
I'll mention first, because this is going to be edited, I was talking to Judy Collins yesterday, and of course she did the most famous version of Send in the Clowns. And so she was talking about how Sondheim never liked that song. He wrote it in a day, which makes me think he probably should have written more songs in a day. He's a little like Paul Simon in that he really takes Simon forever to write a song. I asked him at one point, well, what's the fastest you ever wrote a song? And he said, oh, here it is. And he just picked up his guitar and he played Slip Sliding Away.
Mm.
He said, yeah. He said, I wrote that in 15 minutes. And I turned,
Oh.
he was with, who's the actress? Not Carrie Fisher.
Oh, she's on Friends.
No.
Friends. She was on
No, Shelley Duvall.
Shelley Duvall. She was on
She was in, and
she-
he said, hey, Shelley. No. That's Shelley Long. This is Shelley Duvall. she was in all the Altman films. He said, hey, listen to what I just did. And I was like, huh.
That's insane.
Yeah, I know. But I was laughing with because Judy Collins, and please edit all this out, was saying, of course, she never makes a dime on her version of, well, she sells records for her version of
Send in the
Send in
Clowns.
the Clowns, but she gave him, a Broadway guy who writes for Broadway, a top 10 hit. And I said, well, you should have walked up to him and said, isn't you rich? Because that was really the lesson of that song.
Yeah.
For me, Paul Simon, it's on an album he's not even that fond of. I think he did it in 2011, 2012 with Brian Eno. And we talk about it a bit. It's a song that he talks about how he has less patience, and so his later songs have many more themes. They're not simple pop songs. He really crams stuff in. But the line that and it's repeated. It's the chorus, which is once there was an ocean, now there's a mountain range. Something unstoppable was set into motion. Nothing is different, but everything has changed. I can't even tell you why that gets me, but even just saying it, I was kind of getting emotional.
You guys, there's so much goodness here. The two of you and then him, it's really, really, it's quite extraordinary. So tell everybody, if they haven't already gotten their ears on it, where they can find it.
It's called Miracle and Wonder, and you can find it on Audible, or you can go to just go to the, you can download it directly from Pushkin. And hold on, it's miracleaudio.com, I believe, or miracleaudiobook.com, or just go to the pushkin.fm website and you can find it.
Amazing, incredible. And just real fast, Bruce, why don't you tell us where they can find Broken Record also?
On iTunes or brokenrecordpodcast.com. You can find all the interviews there. I guess we'll have to put up Judy Collins pretty soon. You can go back and listen to like a lot of the great episodes that Rick has done, or Rick and Malcolm doing Springsteen, which was a great, great conversation.
Yeah.
And I seem to specialize in people who are either 82 or 22. So you can hear a lot of older artists who's like Judy Collins, who can just tell stories like she's just such a firecracker. She was fabulous. And you can hear a lot of great new artists like
awesome.
Amethyst Kia, a lot of people, a lot of young women right now writing amazing songs, particularly in country music, which is all dominated by like bro country. It's this complete mismatch. Like the industry is actually missing where all the talented people are. But you can find them on Broken Record.
That's awesome. Well, we had Brandy Carlisle on the show a couple months ago, and she was great. And everybody here loved that. So you should go subscribe. And Malcolm, Revisionist History is on a break currently. Is that correct? Do you know? Yeah, so tell us when's the next thing we can look forward to?
Probably in June.
Awesome.
We'll return.
Thank you for being so delightful and taking your very, very important time when you could be making the next incredible thing and coming and hanging out with us. This was awesome.
We had a blast.